Strange, yet true stories, tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. The legend of the Wendigo goes back hundreds of years. Native American tribes of the Great Lakes region of the United States and Canada spoke of the Wendigo of being a monstrous creature with human-like features, possibly turning into this creature after resorting to cannibalism to survive. The following story was submitted to Strange But True by a subscriber who wishes to remain anonymous, but says the legend of the Wendigo was all too real to him and his friends. This event occurred in April of 2016 on a plot of hunting land outside Richland Center, Wisconsin. Richland Center is a small town in the hilly terrain of southwest Wisconsin. The plot of land is around 15 miles outside the city. It's a fairly large plot owned by my father's friend James, and it has a little hunting cabin on it. The cabin sits in a small patch of woods just off the road leading out to it. Beyond the cabin, there's a cornfield that sits in the curve of U-shaped woods we use for hunting. There is a ridge that runs across the center of the field, sloping down on each side at a steep angle. At the midpoint between the woods and the cabin is a little island of trees that is only about 20 feet in diameter with a deer stand in it. This location is important with my encounter with what I believe was a Wendigo. So James, my dad, another of my dad's friends named George, and his son Elliot, and me went out to the cabin to cut firewood for the hunting season. We arrived around 1 in the afternoon. It was a cold winter day, and we got to work soon after arriving at the cabin. We cut down 2 very large old oak trees on the left side of the U. We worked until dusk. During the cutting, we had lost a few large logs in the ravine after they rolled away from us down the steep hill. Elliot and I went down in the ravine to get the logs that had rolled down. We carried the logs up the steep side and then up the hill to the ATV where we loaded them into a trailer. A total of 5 logs had to be brought up, each weighing nearly 70 pounds apiece. After they were all loaded in the trailer and George drove across the cornfield, Elliot and I made our way across the field on foot. The sun was just above the hills on the horizon, casting our shadows over the treetops to our left. I scanned the tree line for deer as we walked and saw nothing. But I did notice something strange. Typically, there's sound in the woods, birds chirping and small animals scurrying about. The woods were not alive. No squirrels, no woodpeckers, no crows cawing as they always did. Not even the trees swayed. I mentioned it to Elliot, but he just brushed it off. We were about to pass the island of trees when I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. Hoping it was a deer, I turned my head to see nothing but some barren bushes rustling slightly. I took a hard look as I continued towards the cabin, but saw nothing. But I felt as if there was definitely something there. As I turned away, I felt like something was staring a hole in the back of my head so strongly that I had to scratch at the spot. We got back to the cabin okay, and we finished the night by watching television and eating frozen pizza. I fell asleep on the couch instead of my bunk. The couch sat adjacent to the window that looked out at the field. I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. The blinds were halfway open, and I took a look outside on my way to the bathroom, scanning the field and woods around the cabin. I took a hard look at a section of thick briars, and I saw something strange. The moon cast long, thin shadows over what I made out as a face. Whatever it was camouflaged in the light of the full moon, but it had pale, grayish, white skin. It squatted in the bush like a frog, legs cocked out and rear near to the ground with its spindly arms on the ground in front of it. I watched it for a few minutes. It was as if it was just taking in the environment. After a few minutes of standing there at the window, I remembered that I still had to pee. I opted for an empty water bottle instead of the bathroom because I wanted to keep watch on this creature. But trying to get that sorted out, I looked away from the window for a moment, and when I looked back up, the creature was gone. My heart began to race when I realized that I couldn't find the creature again. I finished my business, put the cap back on the bottle, and then went back to the couch, forcing myself to lay back down and try to sleep, burying my face in the cushions of the couch. I awoke in the morning to the smell of frying bacon, not mentioning anything about what I saw in the middle of the night. I got up and ate my breakfast, and we all prepared for another hard day of work. We finally left the cabin at around 9 a.m. and headed back into the woods to cut down another handful of trees that we had marked. We cut up 2 on the east side of the forest, and then we walked directly across the field to the location of the final tree we planned to cut up before lunch. We reached the tree line and were overwhelmed with a metallic smell, like the smell of iron. It took only seconds for us to notice the bright red pool of blood that had melted away an area of snow. There was a disemboweled coyote impaled through its neck on a low-hanging tree branch, with its insides sitting on the ground. "What in the hell?" James shouted. "I'll kill him, that son of a bitch!" "Who did this?" my dad asked him. He went on to explain how the man who owned the land that borders the north end of the woods was disputing the boundaries of his property and had become upset when we set up a new hunting stand on land he thought was his. As we went deeper into the woods, we found more eviscerated animals hung the same way as the coyote. James became increasingly more and more upset, thinking that this neighbor was one sick dude to try and scare him this way. He left us to cut up the last tree, taking the ATV up to confront the neighbor. Elliot and I weren't happy with that because without the ATV, that meant we would have to haul the logs by ourselves on multiple trips, or we would have to pull the trailer by ourselves. We opted to run a utility rope around the trailer and wrap the ends around our waists to pull it. We made it to the cabin in around an hour, but it felt like we had gone head-to-head with the Green Bay Packers. James was back, and he was outside talking to my father and George. He sounded a little upset, not angry, but shaken. As we approached, we overheard him say that the man wasn't at home, but that all of his animals were eviscerated just like the ones in the woods were. Dogs, horses, and goats strewn everywhere across the man's property. "We need to call the police," James shouted. "There's got to be a bear, wolves, a rabid dog, something that needs to be put down." We calmed him down and began to logic it all out. If it were an animal like the ones he mentioned, the dead animals in the woods would not have been impaled like they were, nor would they have simply been torn to shreds like that. Animals don't do that, no matter how hungry they are. Not even a rabid dog could do that. My dad finally made the decision to call the police and stepped away from us to do so. I couldn't gather anything from listening, as it was mostly my dad acknowledging the dispatcher with a "uh-huh" or a "okay." Finally, he hung up and came over to explain that the dispatcher said that most of the on-duty officers were dealing with an overturned semi-truck, and that they were trying to get an off-duty to come out here, but that it may take up to an hour for anyone to get here. He suggested we lock up tight and head into town, then call back in an hour or so to see if they can get an officer out there. Everyone agreed and headed inside to gather a few things for the night. I loaded my bag with a change of clothes and toiletries and was the first one out. As I waited for the others, I realized that all this nervous waiting made me need to pee again. I walked over to the fence that ran behind the trailer and began to relieve myself. I finished up, zipped up, and then I looked up and completely froze. My blood ran cold as ice, and my knees felt like they were made out of jello. Staring at me from over the top of the fence was something I wish I had never seen. I could see the upper half of a face. The skin was a gray-white, saggy, and its features were sunken in. The eyes were the worst part. They weren't black pits, as I've heard others describe them, but they were instead deep-set and a glossy black that I could see myself in. I could not bring myself to move for what felt like an eternity before the others came out of the trailer. James called out to me since I was just standing at the fence, not moving. "Hey, let's hurry!" Holy sweet Jesus, Mary, and Joseph! The eyes turned their attention from me to James, and the invisible hold it had on me broke, and I fell backwards and began to scramble away from the fence. I was screaming and trying to tell him that it was a Wendigo. James opened the tailgate on his truck and grabbed one of the axes we had for splitting the logs. He yelled at it, shaking the axe in the air above his head. It simply stared back at him for a few seconds before letting out this ear-splitting screech. It sounded like a mix between someone skinning a live cat and that clicking sound the predator makes in the movie, and then disappearing beneath the fence again. I had crawled over to where James was by this time. Everyone had heard the commotion and ran outside when they heard the screeching, and they were all questioning what had happened. Instead of standing around and wasting time explaining, James instructed everyone to get into their vehicles and drive. I jumped in the driver's seat of my truck without hesitation, and my father got in next to me. We calmly exited the property, not bothering to close the gate behind us. But as soon as dirt turned to pavement, there was nothing calm about our driving. We quickly drove to the stop sign at the end of the road. Now, understand that I have no idea what possessed me to do what I'm about to tell you. I was a fairly new driver at this point, and I place blame on the fact that I was very particular about following rules. So instead of driving straight through the stop sign that sat in the middle of nowhere, as James did, I slowed to a stop and checked for traffic. I looked in my rear-view mirror, and bathed in the red of my brake lights was the Wendigo in a dead sprint for the truck. As I stomped on the gas, I couldn't tell if the screech I heard came from the creature or my tires. We made the usual 20-minute drive in about 10. We decided that we would meet at a local bar and wait until we got a hold of a police officer or were kicked out of the place. There was an officer sent up to investigate the land the next morning, and not much came of it. It was ruled that the animal carcasses were due to a rabid coyote, despite the fact that coyotes can't impale other coyotes on tree branches. James and I kept what we saw behind that fence to ourselves. I refuse to talk about it with my dad, and whenever he brings it up, I just tell him that he doesn't want to know. We returned to the land later that year for the annual deer hunt, and made it through 2 weeks without incident. I shot a deer just around sunset, and it took until almost 8:30 at night before the deer was out of the woods. 8:30 in November might as well be midnight, and to make things even worse, we had to track another deer after we got back. It had been shot by James's daughter and had run off deep in the woods. We didn't return from tracking it until almost midnight, and even though none of us saw anything, I fear that future hunts may not be as peaceful. I pray to God that I never ever see or hear another Wendigo for as long as I live. This has been another strange but true story, submitted to us by a viewer like you. If you have a strange but true story that you would like to share with us, send it to strangebutTrueStories2@gmail.com. Leave us a comment below and tell us what you think about this encounter. Subscribe to our channel for more chilling stories delivered weekly. Thanks to those who have. We appreciate the support. I'm Steve White. Until next time.